Hey, Melanie, it's great to see you.
Great to see you too.
And welcome everyone to this special YouTube series that we do. Melanie and I get together to talk about this book that she put together, The Family Tree, Italian Genealogy Guide, How to Trace Your Family Tree in Italy. And we go through chapter by chapter and talk about the contents in there. You are able to purchase this book if you like. And also at the end of this conversation, Melanie's going to share this really cool thing she's doing. Hint, it involves this book. So we'll be getting to that in a moment. I also wanted to mention before we begin is that Melanie hosts a Facebook Live series called Presto Italia. And that happens on the last Friday of the month at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. So often she talks about genealogy as well as Italian dual citizenship. So I encourage folks to find us on Facebook and join us there. And you can also find all kinds of great stuff on our YouTube channel. So welcome. But also the best place to go for all the things is the website, ItalyAncestry.com. You can sign up for discovery calls. If you have a question, do I qualify? How do I look up my Italian family? You set up a discovery call with Melanie and she'll help you out. You can also learn more about our services and sign up for our monthly, which may even be going weekly newsletter to get access to all kinds of great information. So we are going to be talking about church records, which is in chapter 8 of this book. And I'm wondering, why are church records the second largest record set in Italian research and the most useful? When did they all begin?
So, church records began around 1583. So after the Council of Trent, that's when it ended in 1583, and that was a meeting of Catholic Church leaders who basically got together to revamp some of their practices. And as part of this, they started the recordation of baptism, confirmations, marriages, and death records. Okay. And then in the 1600s, it was, I believe, 1631 or something like that, they started a type of parish census called a Stato delle Anime. And this recorded whole family groups and also whether they had taken confirmation.
Gotcha. And I mean, many, if not almost all people in Italy at the time were Catholic. So that was the dominant or predominant.
Very dominant, yes.
Very dominant. Okay. So there are two types of archives that one can find in those records. Parish archives, and I can never say this word. What is it?
Diocesan.
Diocesan. I always miss a syllable in there. So could you give a brief description of each kind?
Sure. Now, a parish archive will be found either in the parish, the priest's home, the shed out back. You know, I've found the parish archives. It's always somewhere near the actual parish. Some towns may have one parish. Some towns may have 40. Oh, so, wow. Especially the historical records prior to 1900, normally, even if there's 40 churches in a town, they've been combined. The historical records have been combined in one church, the mother church, the Duomo, the Basilica. So it's usually the biggest church where they combine them. And as far as diocesan records, a diocese is a group of parishes in a particular region. So there are certain records that automatically go to the diocese. After 1900, a second copy of the baptisms go there. But let's back up to what is in the parish: baptisms, confirmations, death records, marriage records. And like I said, the diocese will have a second copy of the baptism, normally after 1900. They will have records of parishes that are no longer open, parishes that have been suppressed or have been destroyed. Anything that, survived would be in the diocese. They have marriage supplements. They have dispensations, which is, where people were related and they needed to get approval from the bishop in order to marry.
Side question. What's the difference between a Duomo and a basilica?
Not much. It's
Okay.
basically the same. It's just a big church.
Gotcha. Okay.
Mhm.
So I'm glad you mentioned there's different kinds of records, because in our last episode we touched on them a little tiny bit, but I was hoping we could dig a little bit more deeply into each kind, a little bit, namely what folks like yourself or folks who are doing their own research might find in these different documents, if you will, that can help with research. So let's start off with the baptismal record.
Okay. The baptismal record, the further back you go, the less information there is. And the further back you go, the less likely you're going to find a mother's surname. But in general, you're going to find the name of the child being baptized, who their father is, usually with last name, at least their mother's first name, whether or not the parents are married, what parish are being baptized in and by whom, and who the godparents are. And if the godparents were from that town, that parish, or were they from another parish, they normally put that in it also.
And confirmation records, what might be found on there, on that kind of document that could be helpful for research?
Those are very similar. Sometimes there's parents' names on them, sometimes there's not. If there is, it's normally just the father. So it's just the name of the child when they're confirming. And sometimes, yeah, basically that. With that is one record that there is a lot of variation to. Sometimes, oftentimes, because you could do the confirmation anywhere between the age of 8 and 12. Some families, because they do a big party, would wait to have 3, 4 kids confirm all at one time, and then sometimes you have 5 kids listed in one confirmation record. Other times you will see each child listed out.
And how about marriage records? What kind of yummy, great, helpful information can you get from looking at that document?
Marriage records are very, because marriage is a sacrament, so marriage records are very, very detailed. So they will often put the date that the couple was interviewed. So the priest had to interview the couple to make sure they met the requirements, to make sure that they had no previous engagements. And it was a series of 15, 20 questions, depending on the time period. And then they'll talk about the posting of the marriage banns. Then they'll talk about what date they're getting married, who is marrying them, who the parents are, where the parents live, if they are married, where the bride and groom live and their names, sometimes their ages, not always. And then there's usually a whole paragraph about the marriage sacraments. And very, very flourishing signature of the priest.
Yeah, you have a visual guide in the book on some handwriting tools, right? To recognize some of
Yes.
that. Okay. And then the final record is death record. Pardon the unintentional pun there.
Yes. And some records are just plain death records, others are death and burial records. By that I mean sometimes they will list the date of death, sometimes they'll list the date of death and the date and place of burial. So I always, like when I'm citing something like that, make sure that if the burial information is in there, to title it that way also.
Okay.
So oftentimes there will be the date of death. They will talk about how they died. So they may say after a long illness, from typhus, that sort of thing, the name of the deceased. They will talk about how the priest, sometimes they would talk about how the priest came and verified he was dead. And it may or may not have the names of the parents. Sometimes women are just listed as the wife of so-and-so, like Clara, the wife of Mario Macaluso. And then later down, sometimes the daughter of Biagio. Sometimes there's not even a surname for Clara nor her father. So it really depended on the priest. Like I said, the further back in the time period, the less information they had in them.
Interesting. And I was going to ask that question, that were there different variables that might impact what is on a death certificate or any of these documents for that matter, that whether gender played a role in how much information they would have, whether the family was wealthy, did like wealthy
Yes.
people have different like records than people who were not wealthy?
They had more words. So for example, also ecclesiastical people, nuns, priests. For example, I translated this death record from it was a nun from Florence, and basically it was saying about her 30 years of service in the church hospital and how she was so wonderful and we're all going to miss her, and how she was the daughter of this wealthy family. But that was very unusual to have so much in there. But because she was a person of note,
Mm,
a person of wealth, and someone who'd done so much for the community, hers was more extensive.
gotcha.
And
And
oftentimes we forgot about the burial. So
oh,
oftentimes they'll say buried on such and such a date. Usually it'll just say on holy ground, because most towns, unless you're a big city, had one
cemetery,
cemetery.
right?
Initially, it started right by the parish, right next door, but then they found that wasn't sanitary.
Mm.
They thought it wasn't sanitary, so they moved all the cemeteries to the edge of town,
Oh, interesting. Okay.
and it had to be downhill.
Oh,
I don't know what they thought was going to flow, but it had to be downhill.
oh, interesting. I never even thought it. I mean, really? I mean, I guess
Hmm.
because of the way they buried people all that time ago, that there was a risk of contamination.
They thought so. I guess they thought so. Now, and then cities grew around these
Yeah.
cemeteries, and then all of a sudden they're not on the edge anymore.
Yeah. Well, there's
They
probably
did
not.
that. They moved cemeteries here, even like New Orleans. As New Orleans grew out,
Yeah.
they actually disinterred everybody and moved them further out.
Yeah.
Um, they didn't normally disinter everybody in Italy. That was a sacrilege
Yeah.
to disturb graves like that.
Okay. Okay. You make mention the role of midwives when it comes to church records. Can you speak to, the
Sure,
significance?
and that's mainly concerning baptisms. So midwives had limited rights to baptize a child when the child was in danger of dying
Mm,
in the process of birth or shortly thereafter. So priests would give them these rights and train them how to do this, but it was very, very closely monitored. And if you do see a child actually survive after one of these baptisms, both baptisms will have been will have occurred, meaning the priest came and did a second baptism.
mm, okay.
Um, and then, they'll both be mentioned in the baptismal record, midwife so and so baptized this child who was in danger of losing their life. And then later on, the priest came the next day, and baptized the child. So you find that sometimes, and they wanted to make sure that the child had that sacrament,
Yeah. Yeah.
just in case they passed away.
What is the state of souls?
So state of souls, that's that type of census I was talking about, where they basically listed out all the families, in the parish. They would usually have the age of each family member and sometimes the occupation. And then they would list Did they confirm? Did they take communion? And there was a third one, and I'm blanking on the third one right now. They all started with a C.
Okay.
So sometimes you would just see C after each person's name.
Okay.
If you found a child that didn't have an age listed next to them, that meant they were under 2 years old. And that meant, and they felt they weren't viable. Their souls weren't viable for this.
Interesting.
They will also note if someone was mentally challenged or handicapped to the point that they felt that they couldn't make these choices for themselves. And again, like some of the other records, the further back you go, the less you're going to find. And often usually at the top, especially in pre-1800 records, they'll say, okay, what farm are they living on? What land? Whose land are they farming? So you'll find that in the top of it also.
And other than the examples that you just gave, are there any other reasons why someone would not get the 3 C's or, would not get the designation or listed for any reason?
Well, it wasn't that common back then. There were people who were not religious. But they may have the first one, the confirmation as they grew up, but they may not take communion because they no longer believed in God.
Gotcha.
But for the great majority of them, they're there and they would still be recorded. The family would still be recorded.
Okay. And then we touched on this a little bit. I mean, the predominant religion was Catholicism, but what about, I'm sure there were other religions going on and recognized and practiced in Italy. Where were those records kept?
The main other religions, at that time were Waldensian. They have their own set of records, and pretty much all of those are online, including their notarial records. So Waldensian was more like evangelical, but what we would think of as evangelical religion. Then there were the Jewish people. There was at least 4 or 5 distinct Jewish communities, and other sections of big cities like Florence and those types of places that had Jewish sections. And then there was the Avaresh, which is the Albanians, and it was a type of Catholicism, but theirs was slightly different in how they practiced. And so those will be in their churches. The Jewish records are going to be in a synagogue. Some of these communities are no longer in existence. So they're kind of hard to find those records sometimes.
Interesting.
And especially when we're talking Jewish records, you have to be Jewish
to access
them. So if you're not Jewish now, your ancestors were, you're going to have to hire someone Jewish to go research them.
Oh, I didn't know that. So if someone hired you, because you're, and if you're
not Jewish,
you're not Jewish,
I couldn't do it.
Oh, I didn't know that. I tell you, I learned something, at least 6 things every time we talk.
So they're very, very much of a stickler on not letting someone who's not Jewish access the records.
Interesting. You said a word, notario. What does that word mean? Notario?
Notarial. So those are notary records. So in Italy, every legal transaction is done by a notary record. Transfer of land, a marriage contract, a loan, a mortgage. There's always a notarial act behind them.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, this has been fascinating, but before I let you go, you have something exciting to share with our viewers and our listeners right now, a new offer.
Yes, well, I am going to start a new course. It's called Level Up, and it's basically a really in-depth, year-long course on Italian genealogy. Well, we'll talk about every single type of source, how to cite these records. We'll talk about, the genealogical strength of this document and against that document. We'll talk about different type of census records. you know, everything that you might ever encounter, we're going to talk about. It's going to be online learning. It's going to be in-person video learning for me. It's going to be recorded video learning for me. And it's going to be the most extensive that I've ever seen on
Wow.
the market.
Very exciting.
And it does. And
they
we get a
get
free
a copy
book.
of this.
That was the next thing I was going to say.
Okay.
Yeah, so you get a free book for signing up with the course. So just keep your eye out for that. You know, we're going to send you information, and I hope to see you guys there.
Yes, I'll definitely put a link in the show notes so folks can go check that out. It sounds like, you know, maybe your Aunt Mildred or something has been always wanting to do research for their Italian ancestors. And, you know, she's got everything under the sun. It might make a perfect gift, if you will. Someone who is really interested in building out your Italian family tree.
Yeah.
It could be a nice little gift for someone to do that. So I'll be sure to put the link in the show notes. Okay, Melanie.
That's great.
As always, super fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.